Welcome back to HANA Basics for Developers. In this video, we're going to return to our very first exercise that we did in the Node.js section, where we use core data and services to define our Odata V4 services. Now, when we originally did that first exercise, we had some very basic services. We just had purchase order, header, and item, and we only really did read operations on them. And that's because, to be able to do more complex services and have other operations, update, create, we want to be able to have exits. And those exits are now implemented in pure Node.js. But I wanted to teach you more things about the Node.js development environment. And now we know enough that we can return and really make more robust Odata V4 services and utilize these exits to have create, update, and delete kind of operations. So, and just as a refresher, remember our SRV module. When we first created it, the first thing we had in there was this myservice.cds, where we defined our POs and PO items entities within our Odata service. And if we were to test this, let's just go back here, we'll test it again real quick. We see our POs and PO items. We have our metadata call. Shows us our introspection of our service with our two entities. And then if we wanted to run them, I need to take that metadata out of there. And there's our POs, our two POs, and our PO items. There we are. That's what we had coming out of our first exercise. But now let's extend this. Okay? So we've got our code snippet, one.text. There we are. I'll left my S off. We want to add a few more entities here to our service. Right now we have POs and PO items. Let's come in here and let's add a couple more things. So in addition to the PO headers and items, let's add purchase order item view. And let's add buyer, our calculation view. Let's add our user details. That's the view sitting on top of the synonym that actually points us back to the user DB container. And then a supporting view here on top of currency. So that you'll see a little bit later. We'll use that in our relationships when we start doing Fiori. So I've set up a few entities here that maybe we won't use till a little bit later, but still useful to have. So what we did here is our PO item, basically unchanged. We are going to allow insert, update, and delete now. This is pretty interesting. Look at this. We said we want to extend items view with a new attribute partners association to buyer view. So what we did here is we took this items view, so purchase order item view, and we have another entity here called buyer view. That's our buyer calculation view. And we were able to extend the existing entity and then add a whole new association to it. So we're also seeing some new capabilities of this new core data and services. The idea of inheritance, that I altered an existing view without having to take a copy of it or without having to change that object directly. And although this items view, I created this in my data model, this could have also been an SAP view that maybe they published into NPN, and I can reference external views, external CDS files, just like I would any other Node.js module. I can pull it in and then I can inherit it and override it. So this is a way that if we look at like S4 extensions, SAP can create a view using core data and services. We can publish it out there, and then customers can add their own additional logic attributes on top of it using this technique, and they're not having to copy. If SAP would then tomorrow extend this base view and it has a couple new attributes, well, my extended view that sits on top of that would also have those attributes in addition to the ones that I added that are customer or partner specific. Okay? So now I take this items view and I expose it as an entity, my OData service. I also take the buyer view directly and I expose it and my user view and my currency. So we'll use a little bit later. Okay? So let's do a build CDS on this to pull in all those new entities. There we are. And now we can rerun. And that did add, you'll notice, that did add some new stuff to our database module, because in our gen folder, even the service entities, they get database artifacts created for them. So we want to go ahead and build our database module to pick up those changes. And then once that's finished, there we go, it's done. And we can go ahead and rerun our SRV module. There we go. And now if we come back over to our OData service, take the PO items off there, what you see is we have many more entities. We've got PO items, but we now have PO items view, buyer, user, and currency. All right. And if we would look at the metadata, of course we have metadata for all these new entities as well. So we see here our PO items view, our buyer. We have the additional association that we added dynamically by extending our view. And even though some of these views are calculation views, we're pulling in the metadata here at the OData level because we built those proxy entities. Remember, you have to go back to the very end of our database module when we were doing the videos on the database. But here we can look at that real quick. Remember, we have certain entities here that are like proxy entities. They already exist as calculation views or existing synonyms, but we use the CDS persistence exist, but we get the metadata because we have to redefine the metadata here within CDS, but we didn't recreate database artifacts. So we have those represented in our metadata as well. And we can test and make sure our existing entities still work. So I can say POs. Yes, I still get my 2 records for POs. And let's look at PO items. And I still get PO items as well. That's good. So we have this new PO items view. Let's go ahead and have a look at it. PO items view. Here we are, PO items view. Even though we were attaching the association directly to this, we still get it, which is a pretty cool feature. I can prove that to you here by just adding in $expand equals partners, and then helps if I spell partners right. Partners. And then you see it expand in place, and we get the sub, then we get the child association with all the partner details. But that was all done without having to go change the original associations, change the original entity definitions. That was the extension that we were able to build in the service layer itself that created that new relationship. Because a lot of times you may not want to alter the original data model. You may not need that relationship, as a view, but we might need it in our user interface. We might need to be able to just list a few of the partner details, like what city is this PO being delivered to. And we can do that extension and expand it in place at the service level to then consume it in the UI. And let's look at the buyer. Sorry, I made that uppercase and that should not have been. Took me just a second there to find my mistake. But now we go to the buyer view, and now we're seeing the data from our calculation view correctly returned in our Odata service as well. So just to demonstrate that we can do that. And let's look at our user entity as well. Here we see all of our user data. Now this was the synonym. This is actually the view built on top of the synonym that in turn points to a foreign container object, the user DB container inside of a project. So we see our OData service. The generic framework has no problem navigating through the synonym and returning data for the foreign object as well. And then finally, let's have a look at currency. And I actually get an error message back. And this is intentional. This is not a typo or a mistake that I made. I have a problem here, and it's basically saying, okay, so there's error during serialization. Let's go to the logs and see what the problem is. And I come back here to the service, and I see, okay. I know where to look here. I can kind of pick through some stuff, and it says not nullable value for code must not be null. So code is one of the columns. It's key, actually. And what we have, if we were to go look at this in the database and look at our view for currency, actually our synonym for currency, open the data. This first value is actually null. So no universal currency. It's a key column, but we've allowed the definition of the table to have a null value in the key column, but OData doesn't like that. It's saying, oh, I can't have a null key. I don't know how to create a URL for null. No problem. In the past, this would have been a problem because we pretty much would have been stuck. But one of the major new features of the Odata V4 framework is that unlike XS Odata, we have exits for the read operation as well. That's something that over the years customers have asked for repeatedly in XS Odata, something that we were never able or willing to do. Now in the new Core Data and Services Odata V4 implementation, we can do that. So first of all, remember back to when we created our server.js, when we initialized Core Data and Services, we said with /lib/handlers. That was telling CDS where it will find the exit handlers. And we even implemented inside lib handlers index.js just a little empty exit handler framework. It's not having to use that yet. It's not having to call that. But let's add a handler for this. So let me go get the code snippet here. And we'll talk about it. So basically, what we can do is we have before and after exits. We have override exits, just like we had in XS Odata. But now we also have different actions. In XS Odata, we had create, update, delete. Now we have read as one of the actions as well. So what we're saying here is we want to attach an event handler after the standard processing of the read action on the entity PO items. And what we want to do here is if it's the first one, so if the length, we want to make sure that we have some data because we don't want to get unbound variables. So we're just doing a check here to make sure we have at least one record. And then what we want to do is this is just to demonstrate the read possibility. Is we're actually going to take the delivery date and we're going to set it to the current date and time, but only for the first record, just to show you that we can override data here. So actually, let me come over here. We'll come back to our currency example in a second. I want to start small, and then we'll go with a more complex read operation. But let's look at this. PO items. And we haven't activated this exit yet, so the first record here, the delivery date, is actually null. Okay, it's not a key, so we don't have a problem with a null value, but we want to update it and force in a value here. So let's, oh, I did not save my change. So let me actually save my change and now run it. There we are. And it's null right now. Let's refresh it. Now it hits our exit handler, and we can tell that because the first record no longer has null being returned, but it has this initialized current date plus 30, so next month. All right. So now that we've proven that that works, let's go fix our currency one. So I'll come back here, and I'll put that in again. So right now, we get an error during serialization because of the null key. Let's get another exit handler here. Snippet. Let's go to read to. And let's get this block for currency. We'll come in here. We'll add another exit handler. Also an after. Also for read. But now on the currency entity. And what we want to do, well, we want to test to make sure we have some data. If we do have data, then let's loop over all the records. And if we find any record that has the value of null, let's replace it with a string that just has the description of NUL. Okay, the results will look the same to the client side, but now that purely null value will be replaced by a character. So then Odata will like it. It'll be able to create a unique URL for it. Everyone will be happy. We won't get an error message anymore. So let me restart that. Here we are. And now let's refresh. And now the error message is gone. Our very first record was the one that had the null value. It's been replaced with the string NUL. And if there were any other null values in here, which there aren't, because that would have been that would have changed the we would have got an error inserting it into the database because it wouldn't have been unique anymore, but it would have replaced any others. Now we could have, if we'd known that was the first record, I guess we could have hard-coded that like this to only alter the first record directly. But I wanted to show you two different ways to do this. We have the entire entity with all the data. We can access it by index, or more likely we probably want to loop over it looking for certain values and then altering those certain values. Okay. So we've had some success now with the read exits. Let's start utilizing our create and updates. So let's go back over here to, we want to take our POs, and now we want to not only read the POs, but we want to begin doing some data creation and authorization. So let's grab another snippet here. So this one is called create one. And what we have here, I want to demonstrate both the before and after. So this time we're going to do the before on a create. We're just going to log the fact that it's happening. But then we're also going to override some data. So this can be useful. We can do validation. We can override data before it's actually inserted into the database. So obviously on creates and updates, you use the before action a lot more, whereas on reads, you use the after action mostly. In this case, we're going to take the created date and we're going to initialize it to the current date and time. And this makes sense. I mean, of course, we could do this in the database query itself, but we don't have a chance to alter that database query, so we'll just default in the current date and time stamp, and then we don't have to worry about the client side always having to pass that in. And then just to show you, for logging purposes, the after create, we'll just log that as well here. Okay. Now, for now, we're going to leave this because we're going to add a user interface a little bit later that's going to call these exits. So we won't really get to test this until slightly later once we have the user interface. Or we could use Postman, as I showed in an earlier video. to test the calls. I mean, you can't just do it from the URL because the web browser is going to do a GET request. These are obviously put and post requests, but still, we want to get the exit handlers in here. We've already seen how the read ones work, but we'll get these others in place, and then we'll have a nice UI, and we can test this more fully and easily. So let's go to our create.js 2, and now we have a more complex example. We don't want to just default in a date. We want to do more validation. This is actually porting over our earlier exercise where we had the XS Odata service. We had the exit where we wanted to validate the data. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to validate the email and our user record. When we do a create, we're going to have we're going to do an override. So this is a this on. It completely overrides the standard processing. We're not going to have the before and after processing in this case. We're going to say we're going to completely take it over. You know, in this this other example with the POs, we used the before, we altered some data, but the actual insertion into the database was still handled by the standard framework, the OData generic framework. When we take on an on event, for any operation, we have complete control. We're responsible. So in this case, we're going to have to create our own connection to the database, and then we're going to create the insert statement ourselves, in which case, we just inserted this into the database. I also see here how we can get, we actually had a sequence on the unique ID of the insert. So on the insert operation itself, we don't pass in a value. It's going to generate a unique ID for our user, but we want to pass that back to the client side in the response. So we can use this query, select current identity value from dummy. It's going to give you whatever was the last sequence number generated. And then we can take that and we can put it into our results. Okay, so we're going to completely override the create operation. For the user entity, we're also going to completely override the update operation. And in this case, we have to build the query ourselves. So we're going to select user details for this user. So we're going to get all the current data out of the database. And then we're going to, we've got the data that's been passed in. We're going to loop over it one column at a time, and pull the values out, and then build an update command. And that's what you see happening here. So once again, to test this, we'd have to do it in Postman. We did see how to do that earlier. It's a little bit complicated sometimes. And maybe if we weren't so close to being able to do our user interface, I would go use Postman, but actually the very next set of exercises, we're now going to transition out of Node.js, and we're going to start learning about SAP UI5. And one of the first user interfaces that we're going to build here, once we get the basics down, is an update user interface that's going to call our Odata V4 service and call these exits. So we'll wait to test this. We'll come back to these exits in our Odata service in just a few videos once we have our user interface, and then we can see the whole thing happening end to end.